You think something remains? I asked, startled. It perched in silence, but when the murder struck, the raven never blinked. Welcome to Revenge Oath. I'm your moderator, Conan Doyle. Drop a comment. Where are you unraveling this tale from today? Your voice turns this story into a shared pursuit. It was on a gray and gusty afternoon in early October that I found myself once again in our Baker Street lodgings, the coal fire sputtering its protest at the chill that had crept in through the chimneys of London. Holmes, ever immune to such earthly discomforts, was lounging in his armchair, fingers steepled beneath his chin and eyes half closed as though in meditation. On the small table beside him lay The Times, its front page folded back and its ink-smudged headline unread. I had not yet settled myself with the day's dispatches when the sharp trill of the doorbell rang through the sitting room. A moment later, the unmistakable shuffling of Mrs. Hudson's steps was heard, followed by a firm knock. "A Mr. Peregrine Talbot to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced, ushering in a tall, nervous-looking man in a dark blue overcoat, carrying a small, square, velvet-lined box clasped tightly in both hands. "Peregrine Talbot," Holmes repeated, his voice sharpening with interest. "With the Kensington Talbots, unless I am mistaken." The man blinked. "Why, yes. Though I don't recall having met you before, Mr. Holmes." "You haven't," Holmes replied, rising and gesturing toward the hearth. "But the mud on your shoes is from Holland Park. The cut of your coat is by Marchant of Knightsbridge, and the bruising on your left thumb suggests recent fencing practice. There are only 2 fencing clubs west of the Serpentine that require gloves with silver clasps. Talbot House trains at one of them." Talbot stared, astonished, then gave a quick laugh. "Remarkable. Absolutely remarkable." "Not at all. You have brought something of importance with you. Please, sit and tell me what has caused such evident distress." The man took the chair I had vacated and opened the velvet box with trembling fingers. Nestled within was a curious object, a brass seal stamp, ornately engraved with a family crest I vaguely recognized. 3 swans over a sheaf of barley, but what drew the eye most was the dark smudge across the handle, and the faint imprint of blood at its base. "This," Talbot said, "was found lying beside the body of my uncle, Sir Archibald Talbot. He was discovered yesterday morning on the grounds of Talbot Manor, quite dead, with no visible wound. Scotland Yard suspects heart failure, though the physician says otherwise. But there is something else." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "The only witness to the scene was a raven, an old pet of my uncle's, and before anyone had arrived, it was seen perched on the body, croaking a single phrase again and again." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "And what, pray, did it say?" Talbot swallowed hard. "It said he did it. He did it. He did it." Over and over, there was a moment's silence. Even Holmes seemed briefly taken aback by the eerie image. "A trained bird," I ventured. "Surely no more than a mimicry, a coincidence." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Coincidence, Watson, is the refuge of the unimaginative. A raven repeating an accusation over a fresh corpse is no accident. Mr. Talbot, I presume there is more to this than a talking bird." Indeed, there was no sign of forced entry. No one saw anything, and yet the study was in disarray. Papers torn, ink spilled, drawers open, and the seal, he gestured to the box. That seal had vanished for over 20 years. It belonged to my uncle's estranged brother, my late father. Holmes rose abruptly. "Come, Watson, pack a bag for the country. We are going to Talbot Manor at once." "But Holmes," I protested, "do we even know a crime has occurred?" Holmes gave me one of his rare, thin smiles. "My dear Watson, everything in this case points to a puzzle of the rarest sort. A dead man, a vanished heirloom returned in blood, and a raven that speaks like a witness. If that is not the beginning of a crime, then I am no judge of human mischief." And with that he turned on his heel and began collecting his hat, coat, and magnifying lens. As I followed suit, I caught one last glimpse of the raven black seal stamp, resting in its velvet cradle. Little did I know that its story, and that of the bird who had seen too much, would soon take us into the darkest chambers of a family secret long thought buried. The journey to Talbot Manor was a quiet one. Holmes, as was his habit when immersed in thought, passed nearly the entire trip in silence, eyes half-lidded beneath the brim of his hat. From time to time he would tap the tip of his index finger against his chin or murmur a fragment of a phrase, no wound, return seal, mimicry, or message, before lapsing again into quiet. I, for my part, reviewed Mr. Talbot's brief but curious account and tried in vain to construct a reasonable theory. The raven's utterance continued to haunt me. He did it. He did it. What manner of coincidence or scheme could have taught a bird such a phrase, and to repeat it at so opportune a moment? Talbot Manor loomed tall and grey, on a rise just outside the village of Little Morden, its chimneys puffing thin wisps into the overcast sky. A gravel path led from a wrought iron gate up to the main portico, where a stoop-backed manservant met us upon our arrival. Miss Talbot introduced him as Chambers, his uncle's long-serving valet. "Gentlemen," Chambers said in a solemn tone, "I've arranged for your rooms and for the study to remain untouched. The inspector came yesterday but left without firm conclusion." He paused. I should tell you the bird has not spoken again since that morning." Holmes inclined his head, but said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the western side of the house, where an ivy-clad turret rose like a sentinel over the grounds. "That room there," he said, "it overlooks the gardens. What is it used for?" "That is Sir Archibald's study." "Sir," Chambers replied, surprised. "Then I should very much like to see it at once." The study was a curious room, not large but densely packed with objects that reflected Sir Archibald's many passions. There were several glass cases filled with exotic beetles and butterflies, shelves lined with ancient tomes on genealogy and heraldry, and in the corner, a wrought iron perch on which sat the raven, still and watchful, its ink-dark eyes gleaming with uncanny intelligence. A half-drawn curtain allowed in the faint afternoon light, casting a diffuse glow across the Persian rug and the broad walnut desk. Holmes strode to the bird first. "Name?" he asked. "Brutus," said Mr. Talbot. "My uncle raised him from a chick. He claimed the bird had a mind as sharp as a man's." Holmes examined the perch. "Seed dish is full, water clean. The cage has not been disturbed." He turned to Brutus, tapping the metal gently. "Speak, Brutus. What did you see?" The raven blinked, tilted its head, but uttered nothing. Holmes let out a small breath and moved on to the desk. "Watson, examine the drawers. List what you find. Mr. Talbot, I will ask you to remain by the fireplace and call out if anything strikes you as out of place." I opened the drawers carefully. The leftmost contained several sticks of sealing wax, mostly red but one of a deep violet hue. There were letter openers, faded parchment, and a tightly coiled length of twine. The right-hand drawer held correspondence from various clubs and acquaintances, though several had been hastily torn open and discarded. In the center drawer lay a scattering of items, a dried sprig of heather, a tarnished brass watch, a handkerchief with the initials AT, and a faint smear of dried ink on the wood grain. "Note," that Holmes murmured, joining me. He lifted the handkerchief with the tip of his cane and sniffed it. "Lavender, not a masculine scent." "Whose is this, Mr. Talbot?" "I couldn't say," Talbot replied, visibly surprised. "My uncle never had much use for social calls, least of all from women." Holmes lifted the inkwell. It was dry. No recent writing, yet the blotter is wet. He bent low, examining the paper. "Only a few strokes here. See? A looping J, perhaps, or the bottom of a Y. Nothing more." He turned suddenly and fixed Chambers with his gaze. "Who discovered the body?" "I did, sir. I brought up the Morning Post and found Sir Archibald slumped in his chair. The bird was already on the floor. That's when I heard it speak." Holmes turned the facts over with visible precision. "And you heard the raven clearly say he did it?" "Yes, sir. 3 times. Then it stopped." "Had the window been open?" "It was ajar." "Yes. Rain had come in during the night and dampened the sill." Holmes moved to the window, his fingers dancing lightly along the inner ledge. Then he peered outside. "Watson," he called, "join me here." I stepped beside him, and together we looked out into the garden. "What do you see?" I noted a winding path, half shaded by tall hedges, leading from the house down to a small greenhouse. "I see the garden path and the glass house. Nothing unusual." "Exactly," Holmes said softly. "And yet, this room commands a view of the entire south lawn. Anyone approaching from that direction would be visible from here long before reaching the door. Unless, of course," he turned and walked back into the room. Pausing before the raven's perch again, the bird stirred, shifting its talons on the iron bar. "What if?" Holmes mused. Brutus was not merely echoing a learned phrase, but repeating something he heard at the moment of death. Chambers looked pale. "You mean the killer said it aloud?" Holmes gave a slight nod. "If Brutus heard the words in the precise context of the crime, it may explain the timing, but then we must ask who was present. Who could have spoken those words in such a moment?" He looked to Mr. Talbot. "Who else was in the house that morning?" "My cousin Julia had arrived the night before," Talbot said. "She came to speak with my uncle, something about an inheritance dispute. She stayed the night, but left abruptly that afternoon." "Oh," Holmes's voice tightened. "A woman's handkerchief, a sudden visit, a hasty departure, and a dead man. I cannot believe Julia would do such a thing." Talbot cried. "She and my uncle argued often, but she's no killer." Holmes did not reply. Instead, he drew from his coat the seal stamp and studied it afresh. "Returned after 20 years, blood at its base. And it belonged to your father, did it not?" Talbot nodded. Holmes tilted his head. "Then we must now ask, why did it reappear here on the day your uncle died? And in whose hands had it been hiding until now?" No answer was given, but I felt a ripple of unease settle in the air between us. Outside, a light wind stirred the hedges. Inside, the raven gave a single croaking rasp. Holmes turned toward the perch. "One way or another," he said, "Brutus holds the key to this mystery, and I intend to hear what he has to say." As the light faded and the manor slipped into dusk, a quiet tension settled over us all. Holmes had begun his work, and I sensed already that this would be no ordinary case. That evening, a chill settled across the manor, seeping into its ancient stone as dusk blurred the edges of the hedgerows outside. Holmes had taken to pacing the study with quiet intensity, his long fingers occasionally flicking at the corners of books or brushing the surface of the desk as though testing for some hidden mechanism. Brutus, the raven, watched him in silence, head swiveling to follow his every step. The bird's silence, so total after its earlier outburst, now seemed oddly deliberate. I, seated near the hearth, had taken to studying the stack of torn correspondence Holmes had unearthed earlier. Most were mundane: club invitations, notices from the Royal Society, a letter from a publisher declining Sir Archibald's latest submission on genealogy. Yet one bore a different tone. It was written in a fine, narrow hand on expensive cream stock, and read simply, "You have avoided this matter for too long. The time has come to resolve what remains between us, whether by ink or blood. This cannot be buried. J." The signature was a single initial, and there was no address. It had been folded once and tucked beneath a half-empty bottle of ink, as if deliberately hidden from plain view. "Holmes," I said, holding it out, "this may be worth your attention." He took the letter, scanning it quickly. A flicker of recognition, or perhaps satisfaction, passed across his features. The inevitable threat, always masked in vague metaphor, ink or blood, quite theatrical, but not without substance. He sniffed the paper, ran his finger along the edges, and passed it back to me. "Note the watermark, Watson. Moncrief linen. Very expensive, not sold in local stationers. Our author likely resides in or near Belgravia." "So the J might be Julia?" I asked, remembering Talbot's cousin. Possibly, but too soon to say. Holmes turned his gaze back to the raven. I wonder, Watson, how much that creature could tell us if only it could speak freely. You think it heard more than it repeated? I think it repeats what it chooses to repeat, which is more alarming still. He turned toward the door. Come, I wish to speak with Miss Julia Talbot, whether she fled guilt or grief. We must learn what transpired between her and the late Sir Archibald the night before his death. We found Julia Talbot staying at a modest inn in the village, having apparently refused to remain at the manor another night. She received us in a small private parlor, her bearing composed but her eyes red-rimmed from recent weeping. She was a woman of about 30, strikingly dressed in mourning black, though her manner was not that of one genuinely prostrated by loss. Holmes introduced us, and she acknowledged him with a curious, half-wary glance. You're the detective, I assume. Mr. Holmes, my cousin Peregrine sent word. I am he, Holmes said. Miss Talbot, I won't trouble you long. I understand you visited your uncle the night before his death. I did, she said, eyes narrowing. And let me say this plainly, I did not kill him. Then you are already aware your uncle was murdered. She blinked. The village is alive with whispers. Peregrine is convinced it was unnatural. And the raven. He heard it, yes, that curious repetition. He did it. Her lips pressed together. A cruel trick of fate, or someone's idea of theater. You came to see him about an inheritance, I believe. She hesitated. Yes, my father, Henry, was Sir Archibald's younger brother. When he died, he left behind certain documents that, how shall I put it, suggested Sir Archibald had failed to honor a family agreement. Regarding the Eastacre property, my father believed they were meant to pass jointly to both brothers, but Sir Archibald kept them. Did you confront him with this? I did. He called it foolishness, claimed father misunderstood, but he was clearly disturbed by what I showed him. What exactly did you show him? She reached into her satchel and produced a folded page, yellowed and ink-blotted with time. It was a partial will, undated, unsigned, mentioning a division of lands between Archibald and Henry Talbot. It bore a family seal at the bottom, a seal nearly identical to the one Holmes now carried in his coat pocket. This seal, Holmes said softly. Did you know it had reappeared? Her expression froze. What? No. That seal was lost decades ago. My father said it vanished after their final quarrel. He believed Archibald took it. Holmes glanced at me, and I saw his mind running ahead. Thank you, Miss Talbot, he said, rising. You have been most candid. One final question. What did your uncle say before you left him that night? She looked away. He said, the past will not stay buried, Julia, and neither will I. It made little sense to me at the time. Back at the manor, night had fallen fully. Holmes requested that Chambers bring the seal stamp and ink blotter back to the study, along with a fresh candle in the torn envelope we had found earlier. He then sat in silence for some time, watching the candle's flame dance and casting long shadows on the wall. Watson, he said at last, the crux of the matter is no longer the identity of the murderer. That is becoming clearer by the hour. It is how the crime was committed, without visible wound, in a locked room, and in the presence of a witness who cannot speak. Brutus, I said. But surely the bird can. Consider, Holmes interrupted. What we know. Sir Archibald died seated, without a mark on his body. The desk was disturbed, the seal stamp bloodied, but the inkwell was dry, and yet a blot was fresh. He did not write, but he intended to, and someone very much aware of what the raven might overhear, chose to act swiftly. You believe the seal was the murder weapon? Unlikely. Too light to kill. But it was present, perhaps placed to draw attention. No, Sir Archibald was likely poisoned. Poisoned, I exclaimed. An unusual toxin, perhaps. One that mimics cardiac failure. Brutus would have seen the act, or heard it, and echoed the guilt. I shivered. Then who, Holmes? He turned toward the window. I am not yet ready to name the killer. But tomorrow, Watson, we set a trap, and should the Raven bear witness once more, I believe he will tell us all we need to know. He stood, and I followed his gaze across the darkened lawn toward the glass house, its windows catching the moonlight like cold silver. In that moment I sensed what Holmes had from the beginning, that this case was less about murder than message, and someone had gone to great lengths to ensure their guilt was buried deep. But they had not reckoned on Brutus or on Sherlock Holmes. The following morning brought with it a thick, soupy fog that clung to the manor's exterior like mildew to old stone. It muffled all sound and cast the grounds in an otherworldly quiet, broken only by the dull calls of rooks from the trees at the edge of the lawn. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated by the atmosphere. He was already dressed and inspecting the garden path when I descended for breakfast, his boots leaving precise marks in the damp gravel as he retraced the steps between the study window and the hedgerow. "Observe, Watson," he called, beckoning me to his side. "Here, the path diverges toward the greenhouse. But note the impressions in the soil here, just off the main track. A woman's shoe, narrow-heeled. Not Chambers's, and certainly not Talbot's. Someone came this way, perhaps shortly before or after the crime." "Miss Julia?" I ventured. "Perhaps. But she claimed she left by carriage mid-afternoon. These prints are older, weathered, but still distinct. The rain had not yet begun when they were made. Likely between 8 and 10 in the morning, precisely the time of Sir Archibald's death." He knelt beside the track, running a gloved finger across the rim of one indentation. "Look closely. There's a faint residue of gray ash. No soil disturbance beyond it. Someone stood here for a while." Watching what?" Holmes looked up toward the study window above. "Not what, Watson. Who?" We returned inside, where Chambers had taken the liberty of preparing a modest breakfast. Holmes declined, pacing instead before the hearth with increasing urgency. The poison must have been administered in the hour preceding death, and not through drink. The glass on his desk was untouched. Not food. He had eaten nothing that morning. No visible wound. So how? He paused and turned sharply. "Watson, where is the Raven's water bowl?" "In the study, still on the perch. Come with me." We found Brutus precisely where he'd been the night before, the water dish untouched. Holmes approached with careful precision, crouched before it, and removed a small glass vial from his coat. "I suspected as much," he muttered. He filled the vial with a portion of the water and held it to the light. "Look, barely perceptible cloudiness. We'll have this tested, but I'd wager it contains a trace of digitaline or aconitine. A few drops would suffice if added to a cup of tea, or perhaps left in something the victim might handle and later ingest by contact." "The seal?" I asked. "There was blood on it, but what if it had also been coated with something else?" Holmes smiled thinly. "Precisely. The blood may have masked the presence of something far more lethal, and if Archibald handled it before touching his lips, or rubbed his mouth in thought, yes, the timeline would align. But then how did the seal arrive on the scene, and why would it have blood on it?" "To draw attention," Holmes said. "To suggest a struggle, to imply it had struck him, a misdirection." He stood. "Our killer is clever, Watson, too clever." They wished the Raven's statement to seem either absurd or damning, depending on the direction the inquiry took. And now, Holmes said, we turn the Raven's gift back upon them. He summoned Chambers and spoke in hushed tones. Within the hour, a message had been sent by telegram to Julia Talbot, requesting her return to the manor under pretense of inheritance, formalities. A similar note was sent to Miss Peregrine Talbot, whose concern had grown acute over the previous day, and whose eagerness to assist might serve our purposes well. When they both arrived just past noon, Holmes had arranged the study to mirror its original condition, the seal box open on the desk, the perch turned slightly so Brutus faced the window, and a small cup of sweetened tea set on a tray at the sideboard, untouched. "I thank you both for coming," Holmes said calmly, indicating they take the 2 chairs by the fire. "As you know, I have taken a personal interest in the unusual death of Sir Archibald. I believe I have made progress." Julia looked uneasy. "You've discovered how he died?" "I have reason to believe," Holmes said, "that poison was involved, administered indirectly. But more pressing is the question of who." There was a pause. Peregrine stiffened, while Julia's hands folded tightly in her lap. "I have considered everyone," Holmes continued, "but the most telling witness remains Brutus." He gestured to the Raven. "He may not understand his role, but he has a memory far longer than most would credit. Memory and mimicry." At that moment, Holmes struck a small brass bell. Chambers entered with a silver cage. Inside was a second Raven, similar in shape and size, but silent. Holmes placed it carefully beside Brutus and stepped back. "What is the meaning of this?" Peregrine asked, glancing warily at Julia. "I merely wish to demonstrate something," Holmes said. "You see, the second bird is a stranger, trained similarly. But when placed beside Brutus, we hope he might be encouraged to speak, especially if the environment feels familiar." Holmes stepped behind the perch and lifted a small cloth from the desk, revealing the seal stamp once more. Then quietly and deliberately, he repeated, "He did it." Brutus shifted. A rasp escaped its throat. "He did it." The bird croaked, low and guttural. Julia half rose from her chair. This is madness. You're provoking him." "Yes," Holmes agreed, "but only to test a theory." He tapped the desk again, drawing the bird's attention. "He did it," he said again, sharply. And this time, Brutus responded at full volume. "He did it. He did it." Peregrine turned pale. Julia's lips parted, but no sound came. Then Holmes turned not to either of them, but to Chambers. "You've served this house for how long?" he asked. 27 years, Chambers replied evenly. "Long enough to know the habits of your master, and long enough to know that Brutus was fondest of your voice, wasn't he?" Chambers blinked. Holmes continued, his tone sharp now. "The Raven mimicked a voice, but not Julia's, and not Peregrine's. The cadence, it was yours. He did it. The same phrasing, the same pitch. I suspect you trained him to say it weeks ago, in secret." I don't know what you mean, but I do," Holmes said. "You found the letter between Archibald and Henry. You knew what it meant. You feared losing your place in the house, perhaps worse. You resented Archibald's treatment of your late master, Henry Talbot." Chambers's mouth trembled. "He betrayed his own brother," he said, barely audible. "Took everything. Henry died with nothing, and this pompous old man kept the seal, buried it. But I found it, and I wanted him to see it before he died. You coated it with poison, left it on his desk, and then watched from the garden, didn't you?" Holmes asked. "And when you heard him collapse, you returned to stage the discovery." "I trained the bird," Chambers whispered, "months ago." So he'd repeat it. I never meant. He broke off, then lowered his head. Holmes nodded grimly. "Watson, if you'd be so good as to summon the local constable." As I departed, I heard Holmes murmur quietly to the Raven, who blinked slowly and tilted his head in reply. "Well done, Brutus," Holmes said. For once, the witness was not silent. By the time the village constable arrived, a brisk and rather serious man named Dalloway, the fog had thickened once more, curling around the chimneys and hedges like a living thing. Chambers sat in the corner of the study, his face drawn and ashen, hands clasped tightly in front of him as if already awaiting the weight of manacles. Holmes met Dalloway at the door and ushered him inside without flourish. "I believe you'll find Mr. Chambers' statement to be of great interest," Holmes said simply, gesturing toward the silent valet. Dalloway, to his credit, asked no immediate questions. He stood for a moment assessing the room, taking in the strange arrangement, the twin ravens, one watching, one silent, the half-empty glass of tea, the disturbed desk, the silent observers in Miss Julia and Mr. Talbot. Holmes turned back to Chambers. I suggest you speak freely. You have withheld the truth long enough. Chambers's shoulders sagged. He deserved to be confronted with what he did to Henry, to the family. I wasn't going to kill him, not at first. But when I found the seal in the attic, packed away with old trunks, it was like a message, the very symbol of the crime. The legacy he buried. You intended it as poetic justice, Holmes said, his voice quiet. The poison was no accident. You coated the seal, knowing Sir Archibald would handle it. You may not have struck him directly, but you guided his hand to his own death. He always fidgeted with objects while thinking. Chambers muttered. I knew he would pick it up. I watched from the garden to be certain. When he collapsed, I returned through the scullery. No one saw me. Peregrine had risen and crossed to the hearth, his expression unreadable, hands buried in his pockets. Julia remained in her chair, her features pale, though there was no mistaking the war between pity and horror in her eyes. But why involve the raven? I asked, still incredulous. I didn't plan that part at first, Chambers admitted, but Brutus was sharp. He mimicked voices without training. One day I heard him repeat a phrase I had muttered aloud while dusting. He did it. It gave me the idea. I began to say it more often when no one was about, enough times that he repeated it clearly, over and over. You manipulated the crime scene, Holmes said, so that the bird would seem to accuse your master's killer, and yet leave it ambiguous. A clever stroke of misdirection. One that nearly worked. It did work, Chambers said bitterly, until you came. Holmes turned to Dalloway, who stepped forward and took hold of Chambers's arm with gentle but firm authority. You'll come with me, sir. You have the right to make a statement. I advise you take counsel. Chambers offered no resistance. As he was led from the room, he cast one last glance at Brutus, who blinked once in return, and then looked away toward the drawn curtains. After the constable departed, a long silence fell over the study. Holmes returned to the hearth and stood, hands behind his back, staring into the cold grate. Peregrine spoke first. I don't understand it. Chambers was with us for decades. We trusted him. He didn't act from greed, Holmes said without turning, nor from hatred. His motive was memory. Resentment, perhaps, for having watched his true loyalty, Henry Talbot, consigned to obscurity. Sir Archibald erased a part of the family history. Chambers could not abide that. Still, Julia said quietly, he murdered him. A moral failing, yes, Holmes said, but not one born of base intention. Had your uncle lived to destroy or discard the evidence, the seal, the draft of the will, Chambers would have lost the only remaining truth. In his mind, he was preserving history, making it right. Julia rose and walked to the desk, placing a hand gently on the old parchment she had shown us the day before. What happens to this now? To the property? Holmes glanced toward Peregrine, who looked genuinely bewildered. Legally, Holmes said, the matter will depend on the terms of Sir Archibald's final will, assuming he made one. If not, or if it is contested, then the courts may have to consider whether this earlier draft carries weight. I care less for the estate. Julia murmured, than for the truth. That my father was not some greedy fool chasing shadows, that he was right all along. Holmes gave her a brief, respectful nod. The truth, Miss Talbot, has been served, if not in the manner we might have preferred. As the day wore on, Holmes made careful notes in his casebook and examined Brutus one last time. The bird had grown restless with the movement of strangers, his feathers ruffled and his eyes darting between us. But he made no sound now. It seemed in some uncanny way his role in the affair had ended. We stayed that night at the manor, at Holmes's insistence, so he could review the documents found in the attic and ensure there were no further clues overlooked. I took the opportunity to explore a few of the lesser-used rooms, finding the manor gloomy and overlarge, its air tinged with old polish and secrets. In the library, I found Holmes seated on a divan near the fire, perusing an old ledger by candlelight. You've gone quiet, I remarked, settling into the chair opposite. Because the mystery is solved, and yet I find myself disquieted. he said, disquieted. Why? Because, Watson, it was the voice of the raven that broke the case. Not deduction alone, not Lestrade's blunders, nor some convenient written confession. A bird, a creature of mimicry, repeated what it had been fed and gave shape to a crime, most deliberate, and yet we listened, trusted its mimicry as we might trust testimony. But it was truthful, in the end, I said. Chambers' guilt was laid bare. Yes, but imagine had the bird repeated a different phrase, something innocuous. We would have been led down another path. The knife edge between coincidence and inference is treacherously thin. He closed the ledger, tapping it once before setting it aside. Still, there's poetry to it. A man murdered by a symbol, by a relic he himself buried, exposed not by his kin, nor his servant, but by a voice he taught to echo without understanding. I looked into the fire. Will you write it up? In time. For now, I suspect it will not be the Raven's story that finds favor with the Strand, but yours, Watson. Your framing, your restraint. I smiled. And your genius, Holmes. He gave a faint shrug. The genius, if there is any, belonged to Brutus. Outside, a single chord broke the evening air, deep and hollow. We sat in silence for a time, the orange glow from the hearth licking the stonework like some slow-burning truth finally spoken aloud. The next morning broke damp and dreary, the fog reluctant to lift in the sky, hanging low over Talbot Manor like a sodden curtain. Holmes was already awake when I entered the breakfast room. He stood by the window, teacup forgotten in his hand, gazing out across the lawn with that abstracted look which I had come to associate with unfinished business. You're still unsettled, I said, taking a seat and pouring myself some tea. Even after the confession, the evidence, the case is resolved. Holmes, he turned to me slowly. Is it? The surface is calm. Yes, but I have always been suspicious of surfaces. Watson, what lies beneath has a habit of revealing itself at the most inconvenient moment. Chambers confessed. I reminded him. He gave you the motive, the method, even the Raven's curious training. Indeed, but let us suppose for the sake of argument that Chambers believes he acted alone when in fact he did not. I set down my cup. You think someone else was involved? Not involved directly in the poisoning, Holmes said, but in the orchestration. Think of it, Chambers, a man of routine and reserve, suddenly takes it upon himself to commit an elaborate symbolic murder and deceive everyone, using a trained raven and a 20-year-old family artifact as the centerpiece. Does that truly sound like the mind of a domestic servant whose greatest previous rebellion was probably polishing the wrong side of the silver? I frowned. You suspect manipulation, that someone encouraged Chambers. Precisely. Holmes turned away from the window, and if you recall, there was one other person in that house who had access to both chambers and the attic. I felt a chill. You mean Miss Julia? She's intelligent, strong-willed, motivated by a personal grievance, and she came bearing an unsigned legal draft. A powerful piece of evidence, but one that only gains value in the absence of her uncle. I do not accuse her yet, but I wish to test her. As if summoned by our words, a knock came at the door. Julia Talbot entered, dressed now in a dark green riding coat and gloves, her manner composed but watchful. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said. Not at all, Holmes replied smoothly. In fact, I wish to speak with you before Watson and I return to London. You mentioned yesterday that you found that draft will among your father's effects. May I see the box in which it was kept? She blinked, caught slightly off guard. Of course. It's with the rest of his papers in my luggage. I can fetch it. Thank you, Holmes said. Bring it here. We'll wait. She left the room with quick steps, and Holmes turned to me the moment she was out of earshot. If she returns with an authentic box containing older documents, we may be satisfied. But if the box contains only that single page, clean, curated, then I will know it was staged. 10 minutes later, Julia returned, carrying a weathered tin document case. Its lock rusted, but functional. She placed it on the table and opened it. Inside were assorted letters, legal drafts and family papers, clearly aged. The will draft was tucked between them. Holmes examined the box carefully, turning over a few of the papers at random. Then he reached for the draft will and held it to the light. "Interesting," he murmured. "The watermark on this page, Moncrief linen." Julia tensed slightly. "Yes, that was my father's preferred writing stock." Holmes looked at her steadily. "Yet Moncrief linen has only been in production for the last 15 years. The draft, will you claim, predates that? Your father died 20 years ago." The silence that followed was immediate and cold. Julia's face drained of color. "You forged this," Holmes said quietly, "not to obtain the inheritance outright, but to push your uncle, to confront him. You likely showed him the false will in a fit of moral righteousness, expecting him to yield, to confess his greed. But he laughed, didn't he? Called your bluff." Her hands trembled. I only wanted the truth acknowledged. What he did to father, it was theft. He deserved to face it. "You showed Chambers the draft," Holmes said, voice low now. "Knowing his loyalty to your father, you planted the seed of vengeance in his mind, fed him a version of the story that ignited long-buried resentment." "I never told him to kill," she whispered. "No, you didn't have to. You manipulated the one man in that house still willing to fight for your father's memory. And you did so with enough distance that no suspicion would fall on you." Watson leaned forward. "But how can we prove she forged the draft?" Holmes lifted the page again. "Besides the watermark, the ink is fresh. Too fresh. It reacts to water differently from any Victorian formula. Watch." He dabbed the corner with a wet cloth. The ink blurred instantly. Ink from the last 5 years. A quiet but damning proof. Julia sat frozen, the mask of composure broken now. But there was no rage, no denial, only a deep, tired despair. "I never meant for him to die," she said softly. "Only to be seen. He hid what he did, and everyone let him." Holmes's gaze softened, but only slightly. "You are fortunate that Chambers acted alone in the final deed. That may spare you legal consequence, but you must live with the knowledge that your actions set the wheel in motion." Julia nodded once, eyes downcast. "I will." We left Talbot Manor later that morning. Holmes said nothing during the drive to the station, his eyes fixed on the distance, his thoughts turning inward like coals banking themselves into heat. Only when the train had begun its slow crawl back toward London did he finally speak. "It is rare, Watson, that we solve a case twice. But this one demanded it. Chambers gave us the first solution. Julia gave us the true one." "And Brutus?" I asked, half in jest. Holmes gave a faint smile. "Brutus told us only what he was taught, as we all do, in the end." I made no reply, content to sit in silence beside my friend as the countryside unspooled outside the window, rolling backward like a story receding from view, its truth finally revealed, though not without cost. The remainder of our journey passed in a silence that was not quite peaceful. Holmes leaned into the corner of the compartment, eyes closed but not asleep, the fingers of his right hand tapping an irregular rhythm against the seat cushion. I knew that pattern well. It signaled thought, not rest. As the train clicked steadily across the countryside, I turned over the events of the past days in my own mind, trying to grasp what precisely had left Holmes unsettled despite the case's apparent resolution. I could not help but feel that we had arrived at an ending, albeit a somber one. Chambers, driven by buried loyalty and stoked by a forged document, had taken a man's life, Julia Talbot. Wounded by a family betrayal and possessed of a dangerous cleverness, had nudged events to the brink without ever touching the blade herself. The truth, though complex, had been brought into the light, and yet Holmes remained troubled. As we reached Baker Street and climbed the familiar steps, Mrs. Hudson met us at the door with a letter in hand. "This arrived yesterday afternoon, Mr. Holmes, from Scotland Yard." She hesitated. A new case, perhaps. Holmes took the envelope, weighing it in his hand before tearing it open. He read quickly, then passed it to me without a word. The letter bore the official seal of the yard and a brief note from Inspector Lestrade. Holmes, just to close the matter on Talbot, Chambers has taken full responsibility and entered a formal plea. No mention of Miss Talbot in the deposition. Curious that. Also, one thing you'll find interesting, coroner found no trace of poison in Sir Archibald's stomach. No digitaline. No aconitine, cause of death officially recorded as cardiac arrest. Thought you'd want to know. Lestrade. I looked up. But that's impossible. You said. I suspected poison, Holmes corrected gently. The signs supported it. The faintness, the sudden collapse, the absence of marks, but I never confirmed it. It was the most probable explanation based on available evidence. Yet now, he moved to the fireplace, hands behind his back, gaze fixed on the cold grate. No poison, he repeated softly, and a confession built on a false assumption. But Chambers believed he had poisoned Sir Archibald, I said. He admitted to coating the seal. That must mean something. Intent to kill, Holmes said. Yes, but not the killing, which suggests another possibility. One I considered briefly but set aside, foolishly. He turned, eyes bright with returning clarity. What if Chambers was manipulated not only emotionally but tactically? What if someone knew he would poison the seal and allowed it to happen, knowing it would draw suspicion away from a more subtle method? My skin prickled. But then, you mean Sir Archibald didn't die from the seal at all? Correct, Holmes said. His death was real, but the method was neither poison or visible trauma. Something quieter, quicker, perhaps cleverer. He crossed to his desk and opened a drawer, retrieving a small folder of notes from our time at Talbot Manor. He flipped through them swiftly, stopping at a sketch of the study's layout. Watson, think. What did we overlook? We focused so intently on the seal, the bird, and the document that we scarcely questioned the moment of death itself. Where was Sir Archibald when he died? In his chair, I said. By the desk. And what was near his chair? A cup of tea, the desk blotter, papers, and the raven, Holmes said, perched only feet away, trained to speak. Trained by Chambers, but possibly exposed to someone else, earlier. Someone with knowledge, toxins. No, not poison. He snapped his fingers. Electrical impulse. I stared at him. Holmes, what are you saying? But he was already reaching for the index cards he kept of obscure medical cases and patents. There have been recent experiments, Watson, curious ones, on inducing cardiac arrhythmia via precise electrical stimulation. There is even a device, crude though it is, that can emit such a current from a small handheld apparatus. It requires contact, but only briefly. What if someone used such a device on Sir Archibald, triggering a fatal heart episode while he sat unaware? And who, I said slowly, would have access to such a thing? Holmes pulled a final card free and held it up. On it was written the name, Peregrine Talbot, patents filed under Royal Electrical Society. Peregrine? I said in disbelief. But he was the one who called for you, who brought the seal. Indeed, Holmes murmured, and in so doing, framed the narrative. He presented the seal, offered a plausible motive, and introduced the Raven's statement. He guided us carefully, so carefully away from himself. The pieces clicked into place with unnerving swiftness. Peregrine, seemingly passive and confused, had steered the entire investigation toward Chambers and Julia. He had even insisted we see the seal, a performance masked by grief and mildness. Holmes was already at the coat rack. We returned to Talbot Manor, Watson, at once, before the trail goes cold again. Within the hour we were back aboard the train, the mist of London giving way once more to the open fields. Holmes spoke little, but I could see the sharpening of his mind, the shift from uncertainty to precise resolve. Upon arrival, we did not announce ourselves formally. Instead, Holmes directed us around the back, where the greenhouse sat empty and quiet, dew glistening on the glass. We entered through the side door, stepping between rows of orchids and ivy. Near the workbench, Holmes paused. "Here," he said, kneeling. Electrical components, old copper coils, battery housing, the casing of a small voltaic device disguised as a gardening tool perhaps. He held up a pair of pruning shears, oddly modified with a wire running through the handle. "This," he said, "could deliver a pulse strong enough to disrupt cardiac rhythm if pressed to the skin." Footsteps approached, and we turned to see Peregrine standing at the greenhouse door. "I didn't expect you back," he said coolly. "No," Holmes replied. "I imagine not. You solved the case, didn't you?" "Chambers confessed. Chambers believed he was the killer," Holmes said. "But he was only the final instrument in someone else's performance. You manipulated him with the forged will, but it was you who killed your uncle, cleanly, without trace, using your own device." Peregrine's expression didn't change. "You have no proof." Holmes held up the shears. "This will suffice, as will the report I expect from the Royal Electrical Society, confirming your experimentation. You knew your uncle wouldn't change his will, so you devised a plan that would leave you the estate untouched by legal stain. Julia would be discredited, Chambers condemned, and you, the innocent heir." Peregrine looked at the shears, then at Holmes. "You're clever," he said softly, "but you weren't supposed to look again." "I always look again," Holmes replied, "especially when something feels too tidy." Peregrine made no move to flee. Instead, he turned away, shoulders slack. "I didn't do it for greed," he said. "I did it because he deserved it. He ruined our family and wore respectability like armor. I wanted justice." "Then you should have sought it in court," Holmes replied. "Not in silence and not in death." As the sun broke briefly through the mist, casting fractured light into the glass house, Holmes stepped past him and opened the door. "Come quietly," he said. "Your performance is over." And this time, there was no raven to repeat the line. Peregrine did not resist. Perhaps he knew, even then, that the game had run its course. He walked between us without word or defiance, the shears dangling from his hand like a forgotten instrument. Back through the garden and into the house we went, the stillness of Talbot Manor now taking on a strange spectral weight, every ticking clock and groaning floorboard suddenly louder, more deliberate. Holmes instructed me to send for the village constable at once. As I stepped into the study to write the note, I saw Brutus shifting on his perch, feathers slightly ruffled, beak clacking in the quiet room. He let out a low croak as I passed, a sound that might have meant anything or nothing. There was no cryptic repetition this time, no accusation, just a sound that, in context, seemed almost like a farewell. When I returned, Holmes and Peregrine sat opposite one another in the drawing room. There was no trace of smugness on Peregrine's face now, no final boast, no unraveling confession. He stared at the carpet in silence, and Holmes studied him as one might study a puzzle already solved, but whose shape continues to fascinate. "I misjudged you, Talbot," Holmes said at last. "That doesn't often happen. I mistook your calm for innocence, your passivity for distance. In truth, you were guiding events from the start." Peregrine looked up slowly. "You make it sound like theater." "It was," Holmes said. "Every piece had its part to play. Chambers, the stagehand with old loyalties. Julia, the reckless playwright with a forged script. Brutus, the chorus. But you were the director. You arranged the scene, seeded the clues, drew the eye elsewhere, very nearly perfectly." "I didn't want to kill him," Peregrine said after a pause. "I wanted him afraid, to know what it was like to sit in that house and feel someone else pull the strings. But he wouldn't yield, not even when I confronted him, so I improvised, like any good actor." "Then why the rest?" I asked, stepping closer. "Why the seal, the letter? Why involve the raven?" "Because a simple death would raise questions, but a complicated death, one full of symbols and mystery, distracts, makes everyone too busy chasing riddles to look at the most obvious thing." Holmes gave a single nod. a distraction worthy of Moriarty himself. Fortunately for you, you lacked the professor's coldness. You left too many threads, too much emotion. The front door opened then, and Constable Dalloway entered, breath visible in the crisp morning air. Holmes rose and greeted him with a short explanation, showing the modified shears and a notebook of Peregrine's sketches for electrical impulses found in the greenhouse drawer. Dalloway, though clearly startled, conducted himself with commendable professionalism. He escorted Peregrine without drama, and the heir left his family home not in triumph, but in quiet disgrace. Holmes stood for a long moment in the entry hall after the door had shut behind them, his hands in his coat pockets, his expression unreadable. "I have always admired complexity, Watson," he said. "But sometimes I wonder if we make it too easy for evil to hide behind cleverness." "You mean Peregrine?" "I mean all of them." He turned and looked toward the study, where Julia's forged document still rested, and Brutus now sat silent and unmoving. Every one of them had a part in it, and not one of them, not one, chose to seek justice by clean hands. Even the bird was trained to lie, or at least to mimic a lie. "But we found the truth," I said. "We always do." Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he walked back into the study and picked up the seal stamp once more. He turned it over slowly in his fingers, examining the brass base, the faint blood stain now dulled with time. "This object," he murmured, "was never intended to kill. It was a symbol of legacy, a mark of what endures, and yet, in the hands of the vengeful, it became a murder weapon, at least in theory. That transformation alone tells you everything about the Talbot family." He set it down with an audible click. "I shall be glad to leave this place, Watson." We departed that afternoon, the carriage rocking gently as it carried us away from Talbot Manor for the last time. I glanced back once and saw the house silhouetted against the low sun, the windows dark, as though watching us leave with shuttered eyes. Back in London, the rhythm of the city was almost comforting. Holmes, ever swift to detach from past cases, resumed his usual habit of plucking at the violin and tending to correspondence. Yet, I noticed a small shift, an edge to his silences, a slight hesitation when discussing the Talbot affair. A week passed. Then, one evening, as I prepared to retire, Holmes called to me from his chair. "There is one final thread, Watson." I paused. "Another twist?" "No," he said, "only a reflection." He reached into the drawer beside him and drew out a letter, one I hadn't seen before. "Julia Talbot sent this yesterday. It's a short note. She's left England." "Where?" "Vienna. To teach music of all things." She enclosed a second letter, though, one written by her father before his death. It seems the original will was drafted, perhaps even signed, but it was never filed. Sir Archibald destroyed it. Julia had found only scraps, but recreated it from memory, so her forged draft was likely very close to the truth, but still a forgery. He tossed the envelope into the fire, where it curled and blackened. It changes nothing legally, but it does change how we remember the story. In the end, every member of that house was telling the truth, or a truth, but none of them told it completely. He leaned back and plucked a slow note on the violin, the tone low and resonant. "Even Brutus?" I asked, half smiling. "Especially Brutus," Holmes said. He simply repeated what he'd been taught, as most people do. The difference is, we listened to him, because we thought he had no reason to lie. The fire popped softly. Outside, a fog had begun to rise once again over Baker Street. In the quiet, Holmes lifted the bow once more and drew a long, wavering chord. "I wonder," he said absently, "how many other cases begin with someone believing they are merely a witness and end with everyone playing a part in the crime." He played another note, then another, and in that moment the house was filled, not with the echoes of guilt or accusation, but with the steady voice of reason, drawing harmony from the chaos, if only for a time. The following morning brought with it a rare clarity in the London air. Blue sky edged with pale sun, and the usual clatter of hansoms and footsteps along Baker Street, humming with a kind of industrious optimism. But Holmes, still at the violin, had not slept. I found him seated at the table just after 7 o'clock, fresh tea untouched, bow laid gently across the strings as though the music had ended in mid-thought. I hesitated before speaking. "You've not rested, Holmes?" "No," he replied without looking up. Sleep offers little comfort when a case continues to stir from beneath its grave. I seated myself opposite. The Talbot matter is closed. Even the Yard considers it so. Peregrine's confession, the modified shears, Julia's forgery, all accounted for. What remains? Holmes turned toward the window, his tone low. What remains is motive, Watson. Not in the legal sense, but in the human. Peregrine killed his uncle, yes, and manipulated the narrative brilliantly. But the complexity of his plan, the precision, there was more at play than revenge, more than inheritance even. I frowned. "You suspect he was acting under influence? Another manipulator beyond Julia?" Holmes shook his head. "No, Peregrine was the architect, but architects build to specification. And I believe someone helped to define the design." He rose then and crossed to the desk, pulling out a small envelope. Inside it was a short telegram, previously unopened. He handed it to me, wordlessly. It read, "Mr. Holmes, if you would understand why the seal reappeared, consult the records of Bramble and Stokes solicitors, Fleet Street, Client Archive, Talbot, 1879, codicil, witnessed and sealed, then struck from record. A friend." The telegram was unsigned. The postmark read 2 days after our departure from Talbot Manor. Holmes took it from my hand. I had the same suspicion, but this confirmed it. We were missing a document. Not the will Julia forged, but something even older. A codicil, a legal addendum, likely naming Henry Talbot as equal heir, struck from record, but not forgotten. And the seal was likely used to authenticate that codicil, which means Sir Archibald not only buried his brother's rights, he may have destroyed formal recognition of them. And that, Holmes said, eyes narrowing, would have turned Peregrine's bitterness into cold resolve. I nodded slowly. So Peregrine's crime wasn't one of opportunity, but of justice, at least in his own mind. But that doesn't explain the telegram. Who would know of such a document? Only one type of person, Watson. Someone within the firm who was there, or who had access to its records. We were in a cab within the hour, Holmes as crisp as a hawk on the wing. The offices of Bramble and Stokes were nestled above a tailor's near Ludgate Hill, a modest brass plate the only evidence of their longevity. Inside, the firm was dark-paneled and quiet, its air thick with old parchment and a certain professional discretion. We were received by Mr. Marion Stokes himself, a man of stooped frame and pinched manner, who, upon hearing Holmes's name, offered a guarded welcome. "You come about the Talbot matter," he said flatly, gesturing us toward the small meeting room. "I expected as much." "Then you knew this telegram would reach me," Holmes replied. "And you know why we're here." Mr. Stokes folded his hands over a leather ledger. "I did not send the telegram, but I believe I know who did. My junior clerk, Edwin Gray. He came across the record during a routine archive cleaning. Told me he'd found a suppressed codicil tied to a property division between Sir Archibald and his brother. And what did you do?" I asked. Stokes looked at us with a tired expression. "I advised him to burn it. I have known the Talbot family my entire career. That document was struck for a reason, but Gray, idealistic fool, must have sent your note before I could stop him. He hasn't come to the office in 2 days." Holmes leaned forward. "Do you recall the contents of the codicil?" "Barely." "It named Henry Talbot as co-beneficiary of the Eastacre and Denholm estates. It bore the original seal, your seal. But Sir Archibald petitioned to strike it on the grounds that Henry was under undue influence and incapable of managing property. It was expunged quietly. No court ruling, just removed." Holmes rose. "Then you've confirmed my theory. Peregrine must have learned of this. Or perhaps Edwin Gray told him. Either way, the seal's reappearance wasn't simply symbolic. It was provocative, a way of reclaiming what had been erased. We left the office at once. As we descended the steps to Fleet Street, Holmes turned sharply and hailed a passing cab. To Gray's lodgings. He's the last loose thread, and I believe he knows far more than he intended. Gray's address proved to be a cramped second-floor room above a bookshop near Holborn. A landlord confirmed he'd taken ill the previous night, and we found him pale and shivering under a blanket, a bowl of untouched broth beside the bed. He blinked at Holmes, alarmed. "I didn't mean any trouble, sir. I only thought you should know. About the codicil?" Holmes asked gently. Gray nodded. "I knew it wasn't supposed to exist, but it was real. The seal was there, stamped clear as day. I thought the truth mattered." Holmes sat on the edge of the chair. "Did you speak to Peregrine Talbot?" Gray hesitated. "Yes. He came asking about the seal, about anything we knew of Henry Talbot. I told him what I'd found. I thought it might help his case." He seemed grateful. Holmes's expression darkened. "You did more than help him. You confirmed the injustice that set everything in motion." "I didn't mean to," Gray whispered. "He never said what he'd do." "No, he wouldn't," Holmes said. "He was too careful for that." As we left, I watched Holmes with concern. "Do you blame him, Holmes?" Gray. "No. He did what the law failed to do, acknowledge a truth buried by power. But truth, Watson, in the wrong hands, becomes just another weapon." We returned to Baker Street that evening as the lamps lit the city in golden pools. Holmes moved with uncommon weariness, as though the resolution of the case brought not triumph, but the weight of responsibility. Before retiring, he stood once more by the window. "This case," he said, "began with a raven and a death. But it ends with a silence, one crafted over years, reinforced by legal artifice, and broken only by those willing to suffer for the facts." I said nothing. There was no need. Some truths had been uncovered, but not all wounds heal with justice. Holmes turned, eyes clear, but remote. "We have solved the case, Watson. But whether we've mended anything, that remains to be seen." 3 days passed, and the Talbot affair had faded from the morning papers as swiftly as it had captured their columns. The public, ever hungry for the scandalous, had shifted its appetite to a jewel robbery in Mayfair. Yet within the walls of Baker Street, the matter remained stubbornly unresolved. Not in the eyes of the law, which had declared Peregrine Talbot remanded and awaiting trial, but in Holmes's mind, which turned over the case like a puzzle missing its final click into place. I returned to the sitting room late one evening to find him once again poring over a small black notebook, the one he used only for cases where he suspected matters of justice had diverged from truth. He looked up at my entrance, but did not speak immediately. "I've been reviewing the timeline," he said after a long pause, "and something continues to gnaw at me." I eased into the armchair beside the hearth. Even after Gray's statement and the solicitor's records, what remains uncertain? Holmes flipped the notebook closed and tapped it against his knee. Everything aligns, too neatly. Peregrine's motive, Julia's forgery, Chambers's misplaced loyalty, all of it fits, but only if we accept that Peregrine was both ruthless enough to kill and theatrical enough to stage the aftermath. Yet in his interactions with me, something lacked resolve. I saw bitterness, even arrogance, but not cruelty. I leaned forward. "You think he didn't do it?" "I think someone counted on us thinking that he did." His voice had dropped, and I recognized that tone. The moment before the curtain lifts to reveal a second act, unexpected and inevitable. Holmes rose and went to his writing desk, retrieving a thin envelope. "This arrived yesterday. No return name, but I recognized the penmanship immediately." He handed it to me. Inside was a single card. "You look too close at the seal, but not at the hands that placed it. Come to the place where feathers sleep. Midnight. Alone." The message was unsigned, but beneath the card lay a feather, black, slightly curved, and unmistakably from a raven. "Brutus," I said softly. "Someone is invoking him. But who?" That is precisely what I intend to learn, Holmes replied. At 1:45, Holmes set out alone, though I followed at a distance by agreement, armed, watchful, and determined not to leave him unguarded. The streets were quiet, wet with the remnants of a late rain. Holmes moved through the fog like a shadow, his steps steady, purposeful. The message had been clear enough, "Where feathers sleep," a cryptic phrase, but Holmes had deciphered it with ease. The bird was returned to a sanctuary following the case. He had told me earlier, a small aviary south of Regent's Park run by a Miss Leary, retired zoologist, keeper of wounded birds. Brutus is there now, and so it was that we arrived at the iron gate of the aviary, barely discernible in the fog. Holmes slipped inside with practiced ease, the latch making hardly a sound. I followed, keeping to the path's edge, one hand beneath my coat. The grounds were silent. A single gas lamp flickered near the side building. Inside, through the smeared glass, I could see Holmes's silhouette. I moved closer, and then I heard it. A low voice, not Holmes's, speaking quickly, urgently. "You said he wouldn't suspect. You said the raven would be enough." Another voice, quieter. A woman's. "He suspected everyone, but not soon enough." I reached the door just as Holmes stepped forward into the lamplight. Julia Talbot stood before him, her hands clasped behind her back, her expression not shocked but resigned. "You came alone," she said. "I seldom do," Holmes answered calmly. "But the message was cleverly phrased, and I believe you've been clever all along, Miss Talbot. Or perhaps it is now Mrs. Talbot, for if I'm not mistaken, you and Peregrine were married in secret." She said nothing. Holmes continued. "The inheritance would have been divided under the codicil, yes, but with no legitimate heir, and your marriage concealed. Your husband stood to lose half the estate, unless Sir Archibald died without ever acknowledging it." Julia's eyes narrowed. "He would have destroyed us. He did destroy us. You saw what he did to father, and yet Peregrine claimed he acted alone," Holmes said. "He believed he had, but it was you who guided him, you who forged the draft, you who told Chambers his loyalty demanded vengeance, you who slipped the shears into the greenhouse, I suspect, and suggested a line for a raven to repeat." Her voice was sharp now. "And you pieced it all together after the fact. Convenient." "No," Holmes replied. "I pieced it together because of the feather, because Peregrine would never have known Brutus's feather from any other. But you, Julia, visited that aviary. You asked for it when you left the bird in their care. A small memento, you said. They recorded the request." Her breath caught just once. Julia's composure finally cracked. "Do what you will," she said. "But know this, Mr. Holmes, you solved the case. But you never felt the loss. That house, that name, everything was taken from us. I only made sure the reckoning arrived." Holmes said nothing. He merely stepped aside, allowing me to escort her out into the dark. We turned her over to the authorities that very night, and in the days that followed. As the truth emerged piece by piece, Peregrine amended his confession. Chambers, overwhelmed by guilt and confusion, said little, and Brutus remained silent now, always silent. In the end, the Talbot case became more than a murder. It was a web of grief and inheritance, of justice perverted and legacies reclaimed by the blade rather than the law. Holmes refused to speak of it further. He filed the case under T, but I saw him pause before closing the drawer. "That house," he said once, "was never haunted by a ghost, only by its own history." And with that, the matter was laid to rest. Or as near as anything can be, when even a raven knows the weight of silence. The winter deepened. By the time snow had settled over the rooftops of Baker Street, the Talbot affair had all but passed from the public memory. The trial, conducted with quiet efficiency behind closed doors, yielded no drama to satisfy the papers. Peregrine Talbot was found guilty of manslaughter, though his sentence was commuted to confinement under medical observation. Julia Talbot charged with conspiracy and forgery, was sentenced to a term of 5 years. Chambers, whose loyalty had blinded him, received a lenient judgment in light of the manipulation to which he had been subjected. Of the estate, little remained untouched by scandal. Solicitors filed appeals, properties were frozen in probate. Talbot Manor itself was sold in silence to a distant cousin, with no interest in its history, and Brutus, the silent witness to it all, remained at the aviary, cared for without fanfare, his voice quiet now, and perhaps mercifully forgotten. I wrote the final account of the case in February, and when I laid down my pen, I found Holmes standing beside the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, eyes unreadable. "You finished it then?" he asked. "I have. It's all there. Every lie, every misdirection, every shadow." Holmes nodded. "It was never a murder case, Watson. Not truly. What would you call it?" He turned toward the window, watching snow fall against the lamplight. It was an inheritance war fought in silence, each of them clinging to something they believed had been stolen: land, legacy, love, and each too proud or too bitter to pursue justice openly. So they plotted, whispered, forged. They turned the truth into a blade and passed it from hand to hand. I stood beside him. "And you? What will you remember of it?" He was quiet for a long time. "I'll remember the Raven," he said at last. "Not for what it said, but for what it represented. A creature trained to echo, to perform. It repeated a phrase that others believed was truth, but it had no understanding of what it meant. In that way, it was no different from the rest of them." "Then why," I asked gently, "did you listen to it at all?" Holmes turned to me with the faintest of smiles. "Because even an echo can tell you who first made the sound." He crossed to his desk and picked up a faded letter, the original telegram that had drawn us into the case. He held it between his fingers a moment, then let it drop into the fire. The paper curled and blackened. "I once told you, Watson," he said, "that it is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. But in this case, even the data had been arranged like theater. And I fool that I was applauded the illusion. You solved it." "I unraveled it," he corrected. "But no one leaves a tangle like that without something catching at the skin." The fire popped softly. A clock chimed the hour. Holmes picked up his violin, and after a long pause played a low, trembling chord, neither joyful nor mournful, but measured, deliberate. A sound not unlike a raven's call held for a moment too long. As the final note faded, he looked up at me. "Come, Watson. The world does not stop turning for ghosts. There is always another case." And with that he set down the bow, reached for his coat, and stepped into the fog-draped street, already vanishing into the cold breath of London. I followed him, notebook in hand, and behind us, the fire burned quietly on.